Welcome everyone. My name is Lisa Baxter and I'm the University of Georgia State Forage Extension Specialist based down on the Tifton campus. Today we're going to talk about managing Bermudagrass hayfields. So I get a lot of phone calls that ask, how do I make better hay? And there's several things that we need to start thinking about before we even get to hay season. And a lot of times we're reflecting on what happened last season. What specifically are we trying to improve? Some producers will say, I need to be more timely with my harvest. Some will address the fertilization challenges. Weed management is probably the most popular question that I get. But then there's a fair interest in insect management, especially related to the Bermudagrass stem maggot. And so we're going to address each of these with respect to Bermudagrass hay production, but you'll notice that a lot of the principles that we're talking about really do apply to many of the species that we grow within the state of Georgia. So right off the bat, in any time we're talking about hay production, we've got to talk about harvest management in terms of stubble height, and we cannot be harvesting too short. It's really easy with newer disc mowers to just lay them down and scalp that grass off right at the soil surface. But we really recommend that Bermuda grass be harvested to an approximate 3-inch stubble height. For some mowers, that may mean that you need heavier shoes at the bottom to help raise that mower height up. But often it's just simple adjustments that need to be made. Maintaining that 3-inch stubble height is critically important for faster regrowth post-harvest. So when we go in and cut a field too short, we're removing all of that photosynthetic material at the top of the plant. And so it takes longer to regrow from the roots below. And so the more green material that we can leave above ground, the faster we're going to kickstart that growth for the next cycle. This also helps improve protection against weeds and insects like the Bermudagrass stem maggot because we're shortening that lag phase and getting back into that linear growth faster. I also like to address harvest height and the impact that it has with respect to drought tolerance. And so this is an example staged down in Florida, and this particular one was with continuous grazing versus in rotational grazing, but the same principles do apply with harvest management. And so these plants here on the right hand side of the screen were grazed or clipped every 2 and 7 days respectively, and you can see what damage that had on the roots below ground compared to this plant on the left where you see more abundant above ground material and that really healthy root system below ground. So again, while this is an example used for grazing, the same thing applies when we start cutting our grass too short with respect to hay production. And so think about it in terms of drought tolerance, especially if you're in a coastal plain area with some really sandy soils. If we go 3 or 4 days without rain, we start to lose all that moisture at the top of that soil profile. And so this plant here on the left is better able to access that material down deeper in that soil profile and access that water there so that it can better withstand that short-term drought compared to plants that have a very shallow root system. So we use a very generalized example like this quite often to show the relationship between forage tonnage and the digestibility or the quality of that material. And so this graph is a very generalized example that shows the longer we let that material grow, our tonnage continues to increase as represented by that black line, but our digestibility and quality have the inverse relationship and do decline over time. Now, in a perfect world, when we're talking about actively growing forages in their peak season, this is going to overlap to where we can optimize both of those around 28 to 35 days. I often hear, though, well, I'll get more forage if I just wait another week. And what we see is that there is a pretty distinct relationship here between that maturity and digestibility. And so if we let that material continue to grow to 6 weeks or even 8 weeks, our yield continues to increase, represented by the total bar size here in this figure, but the digestible material, which is represented by the gray part of the bar, does not. And so even though our tonnage will continue to increase, the amount of material that the animal can actually take away from that hay remains relatively unchanged. And so we would have, in this particular example, been much better off having 2 4-week cuts, if possible, rather than that 1 8-week cut. Not necessarily because of the total tonnage, but because we would be doubling this digestible dry matter. Now, a big challenge with living in the humid southeast is we have a lot of rainfall throughout the summer between pop-up showers and tropical storms. And there's often a big fear of our material getting rained on, whether it actually does or not. And so what a lot of research shows is that even though we may have some pop-up showers, it actually doesn't hurt our material as long as that is occurring close to the time of cutting versus baling. And so if we are able to get in there, let's get it cut, we have a small chance of rain, let's let that happen immediately after cutting if it's going to, and then get that material baled before that next rain, ideally. It doesn't always work like that, but if given the option of, if we've got a small chance of rain one day and the next 4 days are clear, I'm going to opt to just go ahead, cut that material. If it gets rained on, a small 1/2-inch pop-up shower, we don't see a large negative effect from that, and that material's already on the ground drying the next day when we are starting to have that warmer, better hay weather. So again, not always the way it works out for us in hay production, but if we do see the weather kind of shake up that way, that is a way that we can help fit around those rain chances. So when giving this presentation live, I always like to ask what affects our forage quality more, harvest timing or fertilization. And usually the votes are pretty well split. But there's some old data that Glenn Burton had done years ago, I believe it was who had done this work, looking at could we increase crude protein if we just put a ridiculous amount of nitrogen out there. And you are reading this slide correctly. That says 1,400 pounds of nitrogen per year. So you can tell this research was done a couple decades ago and definitely not with today's nitrogen prices. But what they found is that if you put enough fertilizer out there, you can increase nitrogen to a level you would expect in something like alfalfa. The protein to a level you would expect in something like alfalfa. But overall, that digestibility remains unchanged. And so overall, we're going to see a much bigger impact on our forage quality by the harvest timing rather than the amount of fertilizer that we put out, especially beyond what is recommended by our soil test report. Another thing that I always like to point out with this slide is that this is crude protein. It's not good protein. It's not usable protein. It's a crude estimate of the protein that's going to be available. And so very likely everything over about that 16-17% mark is going to be high nitrate levels in that hay, which is incredibly toxic to livestock. So there's a very good reason why we recommend no more than 400 pounds of nitrogen per year, even on a very productive hybrid Bermudagrass hayfield. So shifting gears a little bit, we've talked about making good bales from the respective forage quality, but we also need to make good bales in terms of density and uniformity. This helps with storage, but also fermentation in the case of baleage. So when we look at several textbook values for where losses can occur throughout the haymaking process, you'll see a range for each of these steps. Now, if you do total up the high number in each of those, you get a number bigger than 100%, and you can't lose an entire bale through these natural processes. But it does go to show where these losses do occur, and where we as not only hay producers, but also when we start feeding out that material, where can we start to hone in to start to minimize these losses? Now, with this particular example, it does show a 6-foot bale. You can think about similar proportions down for a 5-foot bale, which is probably a little more common today. But I'm going to jump straight here to this outer 12 inches of the bale. And so in that outer 12 inches, it represents 50% of that bale's weight. In the outer 18 inches, we have 75% of that bale's weight. Now, I want you to think about kind of old hay that you've seen sitting by the roadside for a while. You may see some up near a tree line. It's just been sitting outside for a while, and it kind of has that black, crusty shell on the outside. When you go and put a hay spear in that bale and lift it up, what happens? You lose the bottom of the bale. The sides may start to come off depending on how far you have to drive. We are not blessed with good roads in much of Georgia, and so you may lose the top of the bale. And so by the time you get to your destination for a bale that's not been stored correctly, you may have lost 50 to 75% of that bale's material through weathering or actual just loss where the integrity of the bale couldn't make it to the final feeding site. Now, I love hay production. Those that follow me on social media they know that I really do love the process of making hay and the research around that. However, making hay is way too much work to just have 3 foot or 25% of that bale ultimately make it to an animal. It is far too expensive to be wasting 50 to 75% of our efforts. And so there's things that we can do to help alleviate those losses. Some things that we need to avoid: big kind of loose bales that have the big lumps and bumps on them, like what you see here. The odd shapes, they're going to be a nightmare to try to store, whether outside or in a barn. And that leads to a lot of nutrient losses. If we're talking about baleage, we also need to think about odd shapes for how they're going into the tube, but also these kind of loose flared ends can put some additional stress on the plastic. And so again, we're thinking about one step further than just making quality material. We do need to think about the packaging of that material and how it's going to impact that storage. Overall, the density and the uniformity of a bale is affected by several different factors, but the two that I see that tend to be the most problematic is the tractor ground speed and the PTO speed. Overall, we tend to bale too fast based on our location that we're baling in, the quantity of material we're trying to push through that baler, what our tractor can handle relative to the terrain that we're in, or even the skill of the operator. And so we need to make sure that we're matching our ground speed to the environment that we are baling in. So I don't care what that number actually is for you, but overall we tend to need to slow down to make that denser, more uniform bale. The other part of that speed that you see when we're driving that baler across the field is our PTO speed. And so we want to make sure that we're increasing that to increase the density, but we can't exceed what is recommended for the baler. And so for the most part, that's going to be the 540 RPMs. And so what tends to happen is if we're going too high on the ground speed, that PTO speed starts to lag behind because we're just not keeping a close eye on that. And so we do want to make sure that those are balanced there based on the product guidelines for the baler that you're running. Overall windrow size, the more revolutions that we can have through a smaller windrow, we're going to make a denser bale. But at the end of the day, we don't want to spend all day out there baling. We got to get out there, get done before that next rain comes. And so that's one that we don't play with a lot. Same thing with forage moisture. We have guidelines for how dry that material needs to be. And although, you can play with that moisture range to make a prettier bale, it's not going to make a safer quality bale. So we look at storage. This is some work done in Wisconsin. We'd see the same thing down here in the southeast. And so when we start looking at the moisture distribution of round bales, this is a twine wrapped bale that's sitting on the ground versus one that was elevated on a pallet. Now, the more red you see in an image, the better, because that's going to represent a drier material. The more blue, the worse that bale is. And so a twine wrapped bale sitting on the ground is going to have a lot more moisture intrusion there along the bottom of the bale, and it's going to represent about 25% of that bale that's going to be negatively affected by that moisture, versus they used a pallet in this instance, but anything that could get that material up off the ground is going to be beneficial. Another way to look at this is they evaluate twine wrapped versus net wrapped bales. A twine wrapped bale is going to have that moisture intrusion on the bottom and the sides, whereas a good net wrapped bale, where you have that light plastic layer all across, the moisture is going to be able to come into the top and shed off the side, better protecting about 50 to 75% of that bale compared to what a traditional twine wrapped bale could do. So this is generally where I start to get questions about baled silage. We tend to call it baleage here in the southeast. It does certainly have several advantages. It helps us minimize our harvest losses when we can't get 4 good days to make dry hay, but we can have 1 to 2 good days. It helps us get in there to minimize those harvest losses and to minimize those quality losses. It's giving us a level of flexibility that we do not have often in hay production. However, there are some big disadvantages to baleage. There is an additional cost of that material. These wrappers, even an individual bale wrapper like what you see in this picture, it's not cheap. The plastic that goes onto that bale, it is not cheap. It adds up over time. And so that is another cost into an already costly production that we have to consider. There's also added labor, especially if you're doing an individual bale wrapper. It is nearly impossible to do all the raking and baling yourself and the wrapping to get everything done in a timely manner. You can have a little more flexibility if we have an inline or tube wrapper, but again, it is a lot of extra work. And so we generally need an extra person just to help with the moving of the bales and the wrapping that we don't have with hay production. There's also a very large chance of operator error. And so if you're getting started in this, whatever you think you can harvest in a day, we like to tell you to just cut that in half. There's a very steep learning curve with this that you need to be cognizant of. With the baleage, we also have to consider storage and face management. And so we can't go and spear those bales. We do need a grapple or a squeeze to move those, and we don't like to move them except for right after wrapping or right when we're feeding to eliminate that need or that additional stress on that plastic. We need to avoid kind of these odd shapes like this. Anytime we have steep drops like this, we're going to have the potential for additional stress and tears on that plastic. When we start to feed out that material, we need to be feeding at a rate of a bale every day or every other day. And a lot of times in the southeast, we're not used to feeding all of our hay or baleage at one time. In the case of these big long tubes like this. And so we do need to be aware of that when we open that tube of baleage, we've got to be steadily feeding that out. We can't just feed a few bales to hold us over until we're ready to move to that next pasture. With the baleage, it does also have the risk of storage molds, yeast, bacteria, etc. There are tests that can be done if you do open a bale and start to see some of these. However, the cattle often need to eat right now, and we have to make quick decisions. If we have an individual bale, this is what you see here in the picture. You start opening it and seeing some of these molds. It's not the end of the world just to throw that bale out. Now, if we open it and see these in an inline wrapped, where you're going to see it on multiple bales throughout the long tube of 50 to 100 bales, that's going to be a different story. We're going to send that off to get it tested. So our quick decisions that we make for the molds is if you see white and black molds, like what's on the left-hand side of this picture, they tend to be okay. They're your typical storage molds, like what you would see on hay, dry hay, and so cows are typically going to pick around them, and it's fine. However, if you see a red mold, like what's on the right-hand side of this image, that we say red is dead, and so the red molds are highly toxic. We don't want to offer this bale to the animals. There's a very high risk of just removing that. We don't know how deep it goes into that bale, and so anytime we open a bale with red molds, we cannot offer that to the animals. It needs to be removed. The blue-green bales are in between. Those molds, like you see at the bottom of the image, it may be toxic, it may not. I like to err on the side of caution and say if we open a bale and it looks like Christmas inside with these red and green molds, the bale has to go. It's just too risky to feed this bale to make that quick feeding decision. And so that's how I recommend kind of sorting out these molds. Again, you can work with your local extension agent to get these tested if needed. But this can help you make those quick feeding decisions. Now, this graph can be a little hard to walk through initially, but it does go to show that we can afford a hay barn over time, and that we're often paying for a hay barn that we never built. So we're going to start here at the bottom on this x-axis. So our hay value in storage, we're going to assume is around $110 per ton. It's a pretty typical price based on the USDA hay market reports. The diagonal lines that you see across here represent a range of outdoor storage losses, and so we're going to use 20% for our example here. But you may recall from the earlier slide that a 20% loss is pretty minimal for hay stored outside. So do be aware of that. The losses you see may actually be much greater than this. And so with hay stored at valued at $110 a ton, and if we have a 20% storage loss, that means we are losing the equivalent of about a $13 per square foot barn. Now, I will admit, at the time this slide was made by Dr. Worley a couple years ago, a $13 a square foot barn got you a lot further than it does today. I also recognize that you can't just go build a barn tomorrow. These things take time. We have a low availability of building materials, especially quality building materials now. However, the way that I like to present this is that if we are looking at making an investment for the farm that's going to pay off long term and for future generations, this is one that we can confidently say will pay off. So we're either paying for that hay barn, or we're having to make up that 20% with additional hay, whether we make it ourselves or purchase it, or feed supplementation. So if the material has to be outside, in a perfect world, we're going to store the bales in a north-south orientation. The reason for that is you get a full day of drying across those bales so the sun goes east to west. Now, that's not always possible. I know with the orientation of my research hay areas, north-south just does not work with where the fence lines are. And so if given the option, that's what we would do in a perfect world, but I do recognize that it's not always possible. One that we really have to avoid is storing under or near tree lines. Trees will increase the humidity and the moisture and just really trap that moisture in that area, which increases the likelihood for those losses and storage molds. And so we want to make sure it's in a very well ventilated area. We want to make sure that we're getting good dense bales, storing them so that the flat sides are butted up against each other really tight, and the round sides can have some space between rows. This can help control vegetation between them, so I like to leave about 4 to 5 feet so I can run a zero turn back and forth around those rows just to control that vegetation, again helping reduce that moisture around those bales. In a perfect world, we would elevate those bales, but depending on how many bales you're making, it just may not be cost effective. Or with the site that you have, you can't get gravel in there to raise them up, or whatever it may be. And so what we want to make sure, though, is that we're putting them in a well-drained area. And that may mean moving the rows over a little bit to avoid a low spot, avoiding certain kind of waterlogged areas, whatever it may be, but keeping them in well-drained areas to prevent that weathering on the bottom of the bale. Now, to shift gears, we're going to talk a little bit about fertility here. So it's certainly not an all-inclusive talk on fertility, but just to hit the highlights with respect to Bermudagrass hay production. The reason we recommend soil testing so wholeheartedly is because our forages are only as productive as whatever our most limiting nutrient is. And so what this is to say is that it doesn't matter if we apply a really high level of nitrogen. If our soil potassium is really low, we're only going to get that low level of yield out of that field. Now, we talk about this more with respect to hayfield management rather than pasture management, but the same thing really does apply there. Fertilizer and lime makes up a huge part of the budget for what we're putting into a particular bale of hay, up to 50% in some cases. So there's a reason that we talk about this so much with hay production. The other reason is when we look at the nutrient removal per acre for a 500-pound animal represented in the little red bars versus a 6-ton per acre annual hay harvest represented in the black bars. It's a very clear difference between what a grazing animal removes from that field versus the hay harvest. And that's because the grazing animal is going to recycle a lot of nutrients, whereas a hay harvest is non-selective. So we're going to cut all that material off and take those nutrients to another field to be fed out. And so because of that difference, we recommend testing our hay fields annually and our pastures every 3 years. So very generic forage fertilization guidelines. Again, this does not replace what you would get from a soil test because that's going to tell you exactly what to put out. But with nitrogen, we want to make sure that we're applying after green up and after each harvest event except for the last one. We don't want to send a bunch of tender young growth into winter. With phosphorus, we can apply any time of year. We tend to put it out late summer, early fall, just because the demand for the product that time of year is lower. And so it's easier to get our hands on that material. Now with potassium, we recommend cutting that annual rate into at least 2 applications. You can do more if you want. We need to put the first application out at green up in the spring. And so that's going to be about 40 to 50% of that application. That is for this year's production. The next half that we put out, usually after your 3rd cut or so, kind of in August, early September, is going to be for winter survival, winter hardiness, and green up next year. And so Bermudagrass is what we call a luxury consumer of potassium. And so we want to make sure that we're splitting that application into at least 2. Now with these increased prices, I hear this concern a lot from our forage producers is I just can't afford that full rate that our soil test is recommending. So what options do we have? It's really tempting to cut out 1 or more nutrients, but it's very important with respect to plant health and stand longevity that we keep all of those nutrients in balance. And so one option we have is to apply lower rates of nitrogen and potassium to all acres. You could apply phosphorus in this situation as well, but phosphorus is usually not limiting for us, and so we're going to talk about N and K in this example. When I say lower rates, that means if we can't afford the 100% fertilization that our soil test is recommending, let's just apply the 80% or the 60%. But the important thing is to keep that nitrogen and that potassium in balance for that Bermuda grass. Another option is to apply that 100% rate to just a portion of the acres. If we're being honest, we all probably have either a very poor field that has been lagging for several years, or there's a portion of the field that's always just kind of wet or weedy or whatever it may be that just doesn't give us a lot of production relative to the majority of the farm. And so this is a time that we can just kind of let those areas go. We'll fix them later. We're treating them almost like a sacrifice lot with respect to grazing. But we don't want to drag the entire farm down trying to just save these small areas. What I don't like to hear, so if you're going to do this, please do not tell me, is I'm just going to put nitrogen out and call it good. We really have started to see stands decline over time by producers doing this. The plants really do tell on us over time if we are missing that especially the potassium. Another thing that we need to watch for is our soil pH. And so there is what we would say is an unseen cost of not applying lime. Now this graphic from the Plant Institute here on the left-hand side of the screen shows the relative availability of our nutrients across a range of soil pH. And it can be a little hard to read, but you can see the general shapes here. As our nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, so that's those top three, are at near neutral, so a 6.5 pH, they are the most available. And so as we start to get more acidic, they become less and less available. And so if we have a soil pH in the mid 5s versus the low 6s, even though we paid to put out this much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium annually, because of the decrease in efficiency and availability of those nutrients in the soil, we are losing up to, for this particular example, $62 per acre. Now, I know lime is varying cost around the state of Georgia and the southeast. We have varying levels of availability, but it's all to say that if you can do one thing to a field this year, it needs to be keeping that pH up. In terms of what type of lime, any type of ag lime such as dolomitic or calcitic lime is acceptable. There's other products out there and you'll see them listed at the top of the screen here, but we recommend that they be tested for a a calcium carbonate equivalency. And so what it gives us is how many tons of those alternative materials do you need to be able to equal 1 ton of ag lime. And so a lot of products appear very cost effective when we first look at them because the calcium carbonate equivalency is so low, though we have to put out maybe 10 plus times what we would ag lime. And so we want to make sure that we are evaluating these materials in terms of cost per acre, not necessarily cost per ton of material. So in my mind, there is never a bad time to go put out lime, but do remember that it takes 6 to 12 months in a lot of soils to see a substantial change in pH. At minimum, we recommend 1 ton of ag lime every 3 years just to offset the acidification from that nitrogen fertilizer. So the reason that it takes lime so long to work is the strength of what we call cations in the soil. Now, I promise we're not getting into a chemistry lesson. We're going to look at this as an example with Lego bricks. Now, pretend with me that the brown brick at the back of the screen there is a little soil particle. And now all around that particle, we have good things that our plants need, like potassium, magnesium, and calcium. As we start to get more and more acidic, we start to have a lot of hydrogens move in. And as we dip down into the 4s, that's where our aluminum start to move. Now, because of the strength of these cations, it was a lot easier to kick off something like this little potassium over here than it is these aluminum over on the right-hand side of the screen. And so that's why it takes so long to bring a pH down in the 4s back up to the 6s or even 7, whereas it actually is pretty easy to acidify that soil within this middle pH range here. So it's frustrating how long it can take that lime to work, but it is something that we see the benefit of over time. So as we start to wind down here, I want to touch on integrated weed management. And we do have another presentation that I will be uploading that covers integrated weed management into much more detail. But I want to introduce the idea here with respect to hay production. Now, integrated weed management, you've probably heard, integrated pest management, so very similar. It just shows that we are using every available control technology that we have to throw at these weeds. One that is incredibly important for us within hay production and forage production in general is cultural control. Ground cover is the best defense that we have against problem weeds in our hay fields. Everything that you see on the graphics there on the right hand side of the screen are things that we've already talked about for the most part, and we're going to talk about pests next. Everything that's there helps our good grass grow better. If we have good ground cover out there, we've already won most of that battle against problematic weeds. And so anything that we can do to increase the density of our stand, increase the health of our stand, is going to help outcompete weeds now and in the future. So some common mistakes that I see related to herbicide applications. One, we've got to get the pre's out on time before any germination occurs. And so we tend to hit high temperatures in February, March here in South Georgia where I'm based, long before where we start seeing our warm season annual weeds like crabgrass start to come up, but germination's already starting to happen below ground. And so we've got to get those pre's out early. With our post-emergent products, we need to make sure we're applying at the correct stage of growth, and so do check the label to make sure. But overall, I get a lot of calls about weeds that are too far mature or advanced to be applying a post-emergent herbicide. And then finally, check the label for all necessary instructions, including rate and otherwise, to make sure that we're putting out the product in the absolute best way possible. So if I could distill down weed control into one slide, which it is a challenge to do, but some key takeaways that I want you to have going into this hay production season is that our annual broadleaf weeds need to be controlled when they're about 2 to 4 inches tall. And so for a big portion of our state, that's going to be May and maybe even early June to control these summer annual broadleaf weeds. We've got to hit them when they're low. They can be a challenge to scout for. So what I encourage you to do is look at where you have kind of overmature winter weeds right now. Keep note of where those areas are, and then scout for summer weeds there as we get into May and June. Our annual grasses are much easier to control with pre-emergent herbicides versus post-emergent options. A lot of our post-emergent options for annual grasses are non-selective, or they are injurious to our Bermudagrass, or they're just not very effective against the annual grasses. And so if this is something you had a challenge with before, I strongly encourage you to incorporate pre-emergent herbicides into your weed control plan. And then finally, what we would call our rhizomatous weeds, so things like vasi grass, Johnson grass, horse nettle, are going to be much better controlled in the early fall versus the early part of the season. It can be frustrating to look at those weeds all year, but if we can get one good application out, we're going to see much better effect from that after kind of that late August, early September time frame, rather than really early or really late in the season. So to finally wrap up, I want to briefly talk about insect management first the Bermudagrass stem maggot. So that is the pest that causes this yellowing at the top of the stem, and you can see how dramatic that difference is between an intolerant variety versus one that's a little more tolerant to that damage. Our peak damage tends to occur late July into September, but we can see it outside those ranges depending on weather and your latitude for where you're based in the southeast. We do recommend 2 applications of pyrethroid insecticides per harvest period once you start to see the Bermudagrass stem maggot present. And so we recommend the first one roughly 7 to 10 days after harvest, depending on forage regrowth, and then a second application 7 to 10 days after that. Long term, we encourage producers to plant more tolerant varieties, though we do recognize that they can be a challenge to find, and we have plant breeders working on that now. Last one here is kind of general insecticide recommendations for fall armyworms. All of these come from the University of Georgia Pest Control Handbook. So the question usually is, how long of a residual activity do you want, and compared to when do you plan to harvest that material? So a lot of times we'll just go ahead and harvest, or we'll apply something that just has a few days because we're going to be harvesting next week, and so we want to make sure that we're matching the product to the status of our field. We also need to make sure that we're matching the product to the growth stage of the armyworm itself. And so I see a lot of products that are meant for armyworms that are kind of a 1/2 inch and below be applied to armyworms that are 1.5 inches long. And they're just not going to be very effective. Just like we talk about not applying herbicides to weeds that are over mature, we do not want to apply an insecticide that's meant for a smaller or younger growth stage worm versus one that's older. Now, that was a lot of information presented in that presentation. If you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. You can send me an email. I do ask that you attach your state and county to that so that I can connect you with your local agent, provide you a more localized recommendation. But it's been a pleasure to cover this today, and thank you for joining us.